Lubang Island lies to the southwest of Luzon, separated from the larger Philippine landmass by a narrow stretch of water. In the 1940s, it was sparsely populated, a rural island of fishing villages and small farms. The coastline curves inward in quiet bays. Inland, low mountains rise gradually from the shore. Dense tropical forest covers much of the interior. The climate is defined by heat and rain. The dry season brings long, bright days and hard ground underfoot. The wet season changes the island's character. Rivers swell. Paths disappear beneath mud. Visibility shortens as mist settles between trees. Before the final year of the Second World War, Lubang remained peripheral to the wider conflict. Its fields produced rice and root crops. Coconut palms lined the coast. Carabao moved slowly through cultivated land. News from Manila or Tokyo arrived indirectly and often late. The forest dominated the center of the island. Thick undergrowth, bamboo clusters, and uneven ridges formed natural barriers. Movement through it required patience and familiarity. Once inside, the canopy reduced sound and light. The terrain offered concealment to anyone prepared to remain within it. In late 1944, that concealment would take on new meaning. By 1944, the Pacific War had shifted decisively against Japan. American forces had advanced across the Central Pacific, capturing the Mariana Islands in the summer. Strategic bombing of the Japanese home islands had begun. Shipping lanes were disrupted. Fuel and supplies were diminishing. The Philippines held particular importance. It sat across sea routes linking Japan to Southeast Asia, where oil and raw materials were sourced. Control of the archipelago influenced the movement of ships and aircraft throughout the region. When American forces prepared to return to the Philippines in late 1944, Japanese command recognized the threat to its remaining strategic depth. Military doctrine within the Imperial Japanese Army emphasized endurance and resistance. Soldiers were trained to avoid capture. Surrender was discouraged. Intelligence units received specialized instruction in sabotage and guerrilla tactics. In some cases, officers were told to remain behind enemy lines and continue operations independently if conventional command structures collapsed. Communications during this period were unreliable. Units deployed to remote islands often operated with limited contact from higher command. As American forces advanced, many Japanese garrisons were bypassed or cut off entirely. In these conditions, written orders carried significant weight. A directive given before a battle might be interpreted as binding long after circumstances had changed. By the end of 1944, the war's outcome was not yet formally determined. On distant islands, however, isolation was already shaping events. It was into this narrowing strategic landscape that a young intelligence officer named Hiroo Onoda was sent. Hiroo Onoda was born on the 19th of March, 1922, in Kainan, Wakayama Prefecture, Japan. His father had served in the Imperial Japanese Army during an earlier generation. The family maintained traditional expectations of discipline and duty. Onoda completed his schooling and later worked briefly for a trading company in China before being conscripted into military service in 1942. He was selected for training at the Futamata branch of the Nakano School, an institution that prepared officers for intelligence and unconventional warfare. The curriculum differed from standard infantry instruction. Students studied guerrilla tactics, reconnaissance, demolition, and methods of operating independently behind enemy lines. Survival skills were emphasized. So was initiative. Officers were told that in isolation they must continue their mission without awaiting further instruction. In December 1944, Onoda was dispatched to Lubang Island in the Philippines as a second lieutenant. His assignment was not to lead a large formation in open battle. Instead, he was ordered to organize resistance in the event of an American invasion. He was instructed to destroy the island's airstrip and harbor facilities if necessary, and to conduct guerrilla operations once regular defenses failed. According to Onoda's later testimony, he was given explicit orders not to surrender and not to take his own life. The expectation was that he would continue fighting until relieved by superior officers. Such directives were not uncommon in the closing phase of the war, particularly for intelligence-trained personnel. When he arrived on Lubang, Japanese forces were already under strain. Within weeks, Events would remove the possibility of reinforcement or recall. When Hiroo Onoda reached Lubang Island in December 1944, American forces were advancing through the Philippines. Japanese units on the island were under-equipped and uncertain of reinforcement. Onoda carried his orders with clarity. He was to organize resistance, conduct sabotage, and continue operations, even if conventional command collapsed. He was not to surrender. He was not to die by his own hand. In February 1945, American troops landed on Lubang. Japanese defenses were quickly overwhelmed. Many soldiers were killed or captured. Others retreated inland. Onoda withdrew into the forest with several enlisted men. Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. By August 1945, Japan had announced its surrender following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet entry into the war. News of the surrender was transmitted widely across the Pacific. On Lubang, leaflets were dropped from aircraft informing remaining soldiers that the war had ended. Onoda and the men with him examined the leaflets carefully. They noted inconsistencies in language and format. From their perspective, it was possible that the messages were intended to draw them out of hiding. They had been trained to expect deception. Without direct orders from a superior officer, Onoda concluded that the war had not truly ended. The forest became their command post. The assumption was temporary. The years that followed would test that belief. After the American landing in February 1945, 4 Japanese soldiers remained together in the interior of Lubang Island. Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka, and Private Yuichi Akatsu. They carried standard-issue Arisaka rifles, several hundred rounds of ammunition, hand grenades, and a limited supply of rice. Their uniforms deteriorated gradually, but at the beginning they retained full equipment. They established a pattern of movement rather than a fixed base. The forest provided concealment, but it also required constant adjustment. They avoided open trails and cultivated fields during daylight. At night, they approached villages or farms to gather information or supplies when possible. Caution defined their routine. In October 1945, additional leaflets were dropped. Some included letters from family members, reproduced in print. The 4 men studied them closely. They compared phrasing and signatures. Onoda later stated that he believed the materials were part of a coordinated effort to induce surrender. The group agreed to disregard them. Food became a primary concern. Bananas and coconuts were available seasonally. They harvested rice from unattended fields when possible. Occasionally, they slaughtered cattle that grazed near forest edges. Such actions brought them into intermittent conflict with local residents and, at times, with Philippine constabulary units searching the hills for holdouts. In 1949, Yuichi Akatsu separated from the group. Accounts differ slightly regarding the circumstances, but he eventually surrendered to Philippine authorities in March 1950. His surrender led to renewed efforts to convince the remaining 3 men that the war had ended. Leaflets and photographs were distributed again. Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka continued to operate as a unit. They cleaned their rifles regularly. They dried ammunition in the sun after heavy rains. They adjusted positions as search patrols increased. The structure of military discipline remained intact. Orders were assumed to persist unless formally revoked. Years passed without confirmation that they were willing to accept. By the early 1950s, the remaining 3 men had settled into a pattern shaped by repetition. Lubang's interior forest became both shelter and boundary. They avoided constructing permanent structures that could be detected. Instead, they built temporary lean-tos from bamboo and palm fronds, abandoning them when patrol activity increased. Movement was deliberate and irregular. Food procurement required calculation. Rice was obtained from fields during harvest periods, often at night. They carried it into the hills and stored it in concealed containers. Bananas, coconuts, wild root crops, and small game supplemented their diet. When opportunity allowed, they killed grazing cattle. The meat was smoked over low fires to reduce visible smoke. Fire discipline was strict. Flames were kept small and shielded. Clothing deteriorated. They repaired uniforms with improvised stitching and fibers. Sandals were fashioned from available materials. During the rainy season, clothing rarely dried completely. Skin infections and insect bites were persistent. They treated wounds with limited medical supplies and local plants when possible. There is no complete record of all illnesses endured, but minor injuries accumulated. Weapons maintenance remained central to routine. Rifles were disassembled, cleaned, and protected from rust. Ammunition was dried after heavy rains. Grenades were preserved for emergency use. The expectation of combat never fully receded. Patrols by Philippine forces occurred periodically, especially after reports of cattle killings or sightings. In 1954, Corporal Shuichi Shimada was killed during an exchange of fire with a Philippine patrol. Reports indicate he was struck while covering movement near a coastal area. His death reduced the group to two, Onoda and Kozuka. The loss narrowed their world further. Despite repeated leaflet drops and loudspeaker announcements over the years, some including appeals from relatives, the two men continued to reject the information as fabrication. They examined materials closely, searching for inconsistencies. The absence of a direct order from a commanding officer remained decisive. Routine preserved structure. They marked seasons by rainfall and harvest cycles. They observed aircraft patterns overhead. They maintained the assumption that the conflict continued elsewhere. Time was measured not in calendar years, but in operational continuity. The forest did not change quickly. Their belief did not change either. After Shimada's death in 1954, Hiroo Onoda and Kinshichi Kozuka remained alone together in the hills of Lubang. Search operations intensified temporarily, then subsided. Over time, Philippine authorities shifted from large-scale sweeps to periodic patrols based on reports from local residents. The two men adjusted their movements accordingly. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, efforts continued to persuade them to surrender. Leaflets were dropped at intervals. Some included photographs of family members. Others carried newspaper excerpts or official declarations stating that the war had ended in August 1945. On at least one occasion, loudspeakers were used from the air to broadcast messages. In 1952, letters from relatives were distributed, urging the remaining soldiers to come out of hiding. Onoda later explained that he and Kozuka analyzed each communication carefully. They looked for signs of forgery or inconsistency. They considered the possibility that captured Japanese soldiers had been compelled to assist in deception. Their training had emphasized skepticism. Without direct confirmation from a superior officer, they maintained the position that the messages were propaganda. During these years, their activities periodically brought them into conflict with local residents. Rice was taken from fields. Cattle were killed for meat. There were exchanges of gunfire when patrols approached too closely. According to Philippine records, several civilians were injured or killed in incidents attributed to the two men over the decades. These confrontations reinforced the belief that hostilities continued. In October 1972, Kozuka and Onoda were observed near a rice field. Philippine police were notified. In the exchange that followed, Kozuka was shot and killed. He was 51 years old. His death left Onoda alone in the forest after 27 years since the war's end. By this point, Onoda's rifle remained functional. His uniform was worn but intact. He had preserved ammunition carefully. He moved alone through terrain he had memorized over decades. He avoided villages unless necessary. Contact with others was limited to distant observation. The island around him had changed. Roads improved. Generations had grown up after the war. Yet in the interior hills, routine continued. He still considered himself an officer carrying out orders issued in 1944. The absence of confirmation had become its own form of structure. Without a formal release from duty, the assignment remained active. Time had extended the original directive far beyond its intended scope. Still, from his perspective, the chain of command had not ended. He remained in the forest into 1973. After Kinshichi Kozuka's death in October 1972, Hiroo Onoda was alone. For the first time since February 1945, there were no other Japanese soldiers on Lubang Island maintaining the same assumption. The small unit that had once numbered 4 had been reduced gradually over nearly 3 decades. Now it was 1. Alone, his movements became more cautious. He avoided open ground whenever possible. He continued to maintain his rifle and remaining ammunition. Equipment was worn but serviceable. His uniform, though patched repeatedly, still resembled that of an Imperial Japanese army officer. The sword he had carried since the war's early years remained with him. Philippine authorities believed Kozuka's death might end the long episode. Reports circulated that only one holdout remained. Patrols increased briefly. Leaflets were again distributed, including notices about Kozuka's death, in the hope that confirmation of his companion's fate would persuade Onoda to surrender. He did not respond. By this stage, Onoda was in his early 50s. Decades of exposure to the tropical climate had left visible effects. Medical records after his eventual surrender would note relatively stable physical health, though he had endured years of limited diet and constant vigilance. There is no complete account of his daily thoughts during this period. What is documented is that he continued to act in accordance with his original orders. The forest had become both environment and routine. Without Kozuka, conversation ceased. Operational habits remained. The war, in his understanding, had not yet concluded. By 1973, Hiroo Onoda had spent nearly 28 years in the hills of Lubang. The forest paths he followed were familiar. Seasonal patterns were predictable. What had once required active planning had become repetition. His rifle, a Type 99 Arisaka, remained operational. Ammunition had been preserved carefully over decades. His pack contained basic tools, spare clothing, and the sword issued during his service. Fabric was faded. Metal showed wear. Maintenance had slowed deterioration but not halted it. Age altered his pace. At 51, endurance differed from that of a man in his early 20s. Movement through steep terrain required more deliberation. Recovery from minor illness or fatigue likely took longer, though detailed records from this period are limited to later accounts and official examinations. The island around him functioned without reference to war. Crops were planted and harvested, children attended school, roads improved. For residents of Lubang, the conflict had ended in 1945. For Onoda, the directive issued in December 1944 remained active. Time, in isolation, did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. In early 1974, an unexpected visitor would enter the forest with a different intention. In February 1974, a Japanese traveler named Norio Suzuki arrived on Lubang Island. He had set out independently, stating that he intended to find Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, though not necessarily in that order. Suzuki was not a government official. He traveled with minimal equipment and moved through the island with assistance from local residents. After several days, Suzuki encountered Onoda in the forest. Accounts from both men confirmed that the meeting was calm. Suzuki informed him directly that Japan's war had ended decades earlier. Onoda responded that he would not surrender unless ordered to do so by his former commanding officer. Suzuki returned to Japan and reported the meeting. The Japanese government located Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, Onoda's former superior officer, who was then working in civilian life. Taniguchi traveled to Lubang in March 1974. On the 9th of March 1974, in a formal encounter in the hills, Taniguchi read orders relieving Onoda of duty. The directive acknowledged the end of hostilities and rescinded the mission issued in 1944. Only then did Onoda agree to surrender. He emerged from the forest in uniform and formally handed over his rifle, ammunition, and sword. On the 10th of March 1974, Hiroo Onoda left Lubang Island. He was 52 years old. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Japan's surrender in August 1945. He returned to a country transformed by economic recovery and political realignment. Public reaction in Japan was mixed. Some regarded him as a symbol of endurance and loyalty to orders. Others viewed the episode with unease, noting the lives lost in incidents on Lubang during the intervening years. The Philippine government granted him a pardon for actions committed while believing the war continued. Later in 1974, Onoda relocated to Brazil, where he worked in agriculture. He eventually returned to Japan and established a youth camp focused on outdoor education. He lived into the 21st century, dying in 2014 at the age of 91. His survival was not the result of rescue at sea or confinement in a lifeboat. It was sustained by adherence to an order that outlasted its purpose. The forest remained. The war did not.